So, you know how I said in part 2 that I'd be starting to mine out the individual Foxa categories this time around? Well, as Steve the Skull so helpfully pointed out, I already did that like 6 or 7 major holidays ago. So instead, I'm going to take us down to the quantum scale of this absurdist rabbit hole. And by that, I mean I'm going to drag us through a level of autistic pedantism most people who make a regular habit of talking to someone who doesn't also live in their head would find completely absurd. Also, speaking of autism, I made this series, along with my whole speculative psychology spiel, into a book which is now available for purchase over on Amazon. And yes, there are big anime boobs in it, albeit ones generated by AI. I know, I promise it wasn't my first choice, but it couldn't be helped. It was that or nothing. But anyway, on with today's show. Actually, before I go anywhere, there's one quick thing I wanted to address. No, it's not an ad. I'm still not that big or important yet. It's just, you probably noticed I said Foxa back there when the title of the video clearly says Waifu. You see, the term waifu is just the Japanization of the English word wife. Basically, it's what happens when you say wife with a thick Japanese accent and then some idiot actually puts that in the subtitles. But since my AI TTS program kept pronouncing the word just about every way possible except correctly, I've opted instead for a better version I got from, of all things, an online ancient Sith translator. Don't ask me why the Sith would have a word for wife. Last time I checked, the whole to love and to cherish thing doesn't quite mesh with their power is life and life is pain ethos. Although I guess you could say the till death do us part bit is at least partially on brand, from a certain point of view. But anyway, I digress. Now actually on with the program. Anyone who's familiar with DC Comics' avatar of tyranny, Darkseid, will instantly know what I'm talking about when I make reference to the anti-life equation. If you're not among that number, let me explain. Darkseid is one of the oldest and most powerful members of a race of eldritch beings known as the New Gods. He is the king of a planetary hellscape, appropriately known as Apocalypse, and is often referred to as some variation of the king/god of tyranny. He's one of, if not the main rival of Superman, as he's one of the only villains consistently shown to be above the Big Blue Boy Scouts weight class. Despite this, however, Darkseid's primary goal is locating the anti-life equation, a mathematical, presumably quasi-magical formula that will enslave all life to his will by demonstrably proving that free will and hope are myths, and that the only thing left is Darkseid. Why do I bring this up in a video about building waifus? Quite simply, I intend to create a similar formula for use when optimizing your created companion to your specific desires. But before I can get into that, ironically, the one final variable we've yet to fully account for is sexual attraction. Let's just be completely and totally honest with ourselves now. You didn't click on this video to learn about creatures you could engage in heady platonic conversation. Although I'm sure that's appealing too. The primary reason you're here is because your sexual needs and/or fantasies haven't been satiated by IRL women, and you're choosing this as your fantasy outlet. To be clear, I attach no amount of shame to this. After all, I'm living in the mother of all glass houses, what with my spending a decent chunk of my own life composing this scandalous grimoire. But in any event, since the main reason you're here is to stack your deck of sexual wildcards, we need to know the rules of that game before we can even start to collect, let alone play.
We interrupt this program again to bring you another post hoc explanation. This video's script is a straight-up abridged cop/paste of a Waifu manual's final chapter, which itself is a cop/paste of Wolf's speculative psychology series here on YouTube. So if you hear him say things that sound out of place like section, or if he makes reference to things that don't seem to exist, just know he's referring to those other videos, which we'll have linked to a playlist of down in the description. Thanks for your patience. Now back on with it.
And it's here where I need to introduce you to the concept of arousal patterns. You'll recall before how we broke down the dichometric boxes of sex and gender? Well, now we're going to do the same thing with sexual orientation. Only this time, there actually is a false dichotomy at play, rather than one side of the coin simply being conflated for the entire package, including the edge and the mint. As you can surmise from the on-screen chart, an arousal pattern is more analogous to a Myers-Briggs personality type than a binary constant. When we consider the sheer amount of fetishes that exist, or can potentially exist, then the reality is that we're looking at a nigh infinitely sided die, which we can then choose to cast as many times as we want. So, what is a fetish, and how do we come by them? Well, the answer to that first question is very simple and straightforward. A fetish is any time we derive sexual arousal from something unrelated to biological procreation. And yes, this does include homoerotica, since it's not physiologically possible to procreate with someone of the same sex as you. But it's possible to have variance even within that. For example, a heterosexual man, meaning a man who finds the female form arousing, can also find a penis arousing while also being disgusted by the male form. This is where futanari come from. The theory for why is that during our evolutionary past, a man generally would not have sex with a woman in a context where other men are present, thus his lack of association of the male form with sexual intimacy. However, unless you're having sex in the void or you're built like a beach ball, it's rather hard not to see your own junk during the deed, so it might have wormed into our wetware that if penis equals erect and woman equals naked, then sexy time equals go. So what does all this have to do with getting off to being stepped on or the sensation of latex? Well, it's just like what was said when we were talking about furries in the last section. Platonic devices encountered and categorized during childhood can sometimes be encountered or experienced in such a way as to elicit unusual connections, connotations, or conclusions when revisited through the lens of sexual hormones. E.g., a dog, a soft, lovable companion, a sibling, a strong yet often incendiary bond, or a mother's womb, a warm, soft, cozy little hideaway. You get the idea. Basically, what I'm trying to get at is that the reason why puberty is so stressful, well, one of the reasons anyway, is because you're essentially being forced to map the new topography of sexual arousal onto your previous Platonic map of normal. This is why Sigmund Freud so heavily emphasized sex and sexuality in his theories. Granted, his working in one of the more sexually repressive eras in recent history probably also played a hand in his motivation as a practicing clinical brain witch. And while I've personally always held that personality types are just astrological signs for men, as they're the most convenient means I have at my disposal for quantifying the mind's firmware, I'm simply going to rely on a Big 5 plus Dark Tetrad model. For those who don't know, the Big 5 personality traits are 1. Extroversion, the degree to which they initiate social interactivity. 2. Agreeableness, the degree to which they follow or lead a given situation, their level of assertiveness or meekness. 3. Neuroticism, their sensitivity to negative emotion. 4. Conscientiousness, the degree to which they know and or care about the impact their actions have on other people. And 5. Openness, willingness to entertain, explore, and or accept novel ideas and behaviors. These are the main mental gauge used by clinical psychologists and psychiatrists today, and so are going to serve as my primary variable set for determining compatibility with your chosen foxa. As for how to quantize them, for the sake of simplicity, we'll default to the colloquial 1 to 10 scale, with 1 being repulsive and 10 being very attractive. Thus, our not exactly minor task is to figure out how to translate the Big 5 into that, for which I've chosen a very similar method to how an IQ score is tabulated. Basically, we take an average of 100 possible scenarios in which the subject is inclined to make decisions based solely on their personality bias. For example, let's say that out of 100 instances wherein a subject is given a choice between being very agreeable, 10, somewhat agreeable, 5, or disagreeable, 1, let's say they fully cave to the momentum of the circumstance for a max score of 10 per instance, 53 times, partially negotiate on their own behalf at around a 7 level 14 times, and outright refuse to follow along with the situation at a reluctance of 3, a whopping 2 whole times for a grand total of 634, which, divided by 10, produces an agreeableness rating of 6.34 out of 10. Now apply this method to all 5 traits and take the average to find your fox's overall personality profile score. Great, so we're ready to make our foxa then, right? Not so fast. Notice the very last chunk on that equation? That is what is most typically referred to as the dark triad, but which I'm choosing to refer to as the antisocial triad instead, since A, I find describing morality to biology to be a bit like trying to put a monetary value on thoughts, and B, there is also a pro-social triad which outwardly presents very similarly, but inwardly stems from polar opposite roots. Now we know that women tend to be attracted to men who display these and associated traits, and for men it tends to be the reverse, though there are exceptions, obviously. So if you are that statistical anomaly, aka a woman who's watching this, or you just happen to lean more the way of the masculine type, in theory, it should be as simple as reversing the above equation. And obviously, as it's functionally impossible for me to adequately distill the entirety of the concept of Rule 34 down into a single algebraic sentence, the next best thing would be for me to simply add in a notational scale, n, which can be adjusted to the individual's personal preferences by weight of x. Basically, take your arousal pattern of choice, apply a 1-10 ranking of just how hot you find it compared to a standard attractiveness model, aka the average woman. Then add the total n and divide by 10 to get the total nx score. For instance, if your n equals BDSM and its x equals 5, any potential foxer would need to have a combined P profile and sexual palette that can accommodate a level 5 BDSM kink. And now finally, we have all our variables accounted for and all our weights more or less calibrated. The time at last has come to put it all together and construct our master foxa formulae. Behold. And now, of course, comes the point where I must plug my eponymous book, The Ultimate Waifu Creation Manual, now available on Amazon. And contrary to what the name implies, it's really the totality of my videos on speculative psychology, compiled and arranged into a vehicle of personal discovery, thinly disguised as a soft-core Gooner pamphlet. So if that sounds like your cup of spice, it's available in hardcover and ebook formats at the link provided down in the description. And with that, once more, I thank you for your support and attention, and until I see you again, as always, stay safe, stay sane, and remember, you can never think too much, you can only think badly. Peace be upon you.